There was a time when getting a loan didn't mean walking into an institution and leaving with a check. It meant finding the right person, because banks as we know them didn't yet exist. This is the story of the family that transformed finance into a system formed through corruption, conspiracy, and a murder so public it shocked an entire city. A system that still shapes the world today. This is where it all began. Florence in the 1400s liked to think of itself as different. Across Europe, power was usually obvious. Kings ruled by blood, lords ruled by force. Authority was visible, castles on hills, soldiers in the streets, banners raised to show who was in charge. Florence had none of that. No king, no royal family, no throne. On paper, it was a republic. The city was run by councils and short-term offices that rotated constantly, designed to stop any one family from holding power for too long. And for most people, that story worked. Florence was wealthy, crowded, restless. Bankers, merchants, craftsmen, politicians, all competing inside a system that looked fair enough to keep the city stable. Elections were held, officials changed, laws were debated and rewritten. From the outside, Florence looked orderly. But stability doesn't happen by accident. Look past the speeches and the laws and patterns emerge. Certain families always seem protected. The same names keep returning to positions that matter. Decisions don't need to be announced to be felt. No soldiers marching through the streets, no cities seized, no flags or banners raised to signal a takeover. Just the same interests winning, again and again. In a city where power wasn't claimed openly, control didn't look like rule. It looked like inevitability. And the people who understood that best weren't nobles or generals. In Florence, power flowed through money long before it showed itself in politics. Trade, loans, credit. These decided who survived a bad year and who didn't. They decided which businesses expanded, which families stayed influential, and which quietly disappeared from public life. At the center of that system was one family, the Medici. They didn't begin as rulers. They rose as bankers, building their position step by step through finance and trade. Their business grew alongside Florence itself, until lending money became a way of shaping the city's future. As their influence spread, it stopped being invisible. By the early 1400s, the Medici were no longer just successful. They were unavoidable, and that made them dangerous to the families who had traditionally dominated Florentine politics. In 1433, those rivals finally moved. Cosimo de' Medici was arrested and exiled, pushed out of the city in an attempt to break the family's hold on power. It didn't last. Within a year, the political balance shifted. Cosimo returned to Florence in 1434, backed by allies who had quietly benefited from Medici money all along. But the Medici who returned were different from the ones who had been expelled. They didn't try to dominate openly again. They avoided holding the highest offices. They stopped placing themselves at the center of political life. Instead, they made sure that the people who mattered, judges, officials, power brokers, either depended on them or couldn't function without their support. Before exile, the Medici had exercised power. After exile, they engineered the conditions that made opposition impossible. Florence still worked. The institutions still existed. But from that point on, the city no longer moved by chance. The Medici had learned how power really worked and how to keep it. For a time, the system worked. Florence was wealthy. Trade was strong. Business expanded. The families in charge stayed in charge. Decisions went the way the Medici wanted without anyone needing to challenge them openly. From the outside, it looked like stability. But that stability was built on money, loans, credit, and financial pressure. And systems like that only work as long as everyone believes they have no better option. By the middle of the 1400s, that belief was starting to weaken. Florence didn't exist on its own. It was surrounded by rival cities and competing powers. Wars still had to be fought. Alliances still had to be paid for. And no amount of banking influence could stop foreign threats or military pressure completely. Money could delay conflict. It could influence decisions, but it couldn't remove danger altogether. As Florence grew richer, it also became a bigger target. Every war required funding. Every alliance came with risk. And every setback whether military or political, created new enemies who owed the Medici nothing. Inside the city, frustration built slowly. Families who had lost influence didn't disappear, they waited. They followed the rules because the rules left them no choice. But the longer they were shut out, the clearer it became that there was no legal way back into power. Loans could be denied, courts could be influenced, elections could be managed, but resentment couldn't be canceled. And that was the real problem. The system the Medici had built left no peaceful path for serious opposition. Anyone who wanted power back couldn't win it through politics, finance, or law, which meant that if a challenge came, it wouldn't come quietly. It would come through violence. This was the limit of money-based control. When every normal route is closed, the only way left is to break the system itself. In public, in front of everyone, and in a way that forces a response. By the late 1470s, Florence was moving steadily toward that point. Florence did not keep a large standing army. Most Italian cities didn't. Maintaining permanent soldiers was expensive, politically risky, and dangerous for anyone trying to rule quietly. Armies could turn on their employers just as easily as their enemies. So, when wars had to be fought, Florence did what most Italian states did. It hired violence. Mercenary commanders, known as condottieri, were paid to fight Florence's wars. They brought their own soldiers, their own weapons, and their own loyalty, which lasted only as long as the money did. This arrangement suited the Medici perfectly. They didn't need to command armies themselves. Florence paid the contracts. The fighting happened outside the city, and when villages were burned or enemies crushed, responsibility stayed at arm's length. Violence became a service. If a rival city threatened Florence, mercenaries were sent. If borders were disputed, mercenaries decided them. If pressure needed to be applied, mercenaries applied it. This kind of warfare was brutal and unpredictable. Entire regions were devastated to force negotiations. Crops were destroyed. Civilians suffered. The goal wasn't honor, it was leverage. And while the Medici didn't lead these campaigns, they benefited from the results. Victories strengthened Florence. Defeats weakened rivals. Every successful contract reinforced the idea that opposing Florence, and by extension, the Medici, came at a cost. Inside the city, the message was clear. Power wasn't just backed by money anymore. It was backed by the knowledge that force could be hired when needed. This didn't replace the Medici system, as it protected it. Money still controlled the city. But violence now guarded the edges. And once violence becomes part of a system, challenges stop being theoretical. They become dangerous. The challenge didn't come quietly. It didn't come through courts, councils, or elections. And it didn't come from the edges of Florentine society. It came from the center. In 1478, a group of powerful rivals decided that the Medici system couldn't be weakened gradually. It had to be broken in a single moment, publicly, violently, and in front of the entire city. Their plan was simple: kill the Medici leadership in one strike. Do it in a place no one would expect violence, and leave Florence with no clear authority left to respond. The men behind the plot were the Pazzi, a rival banking family who had been pushed aside as Medici influence grew. But this wasn't just a family feud. The conspiracy had backing at the highest level. The Medici had deep financial influence inside the church, handling papal money and limiting who benefited from it. That made them enemies in Rome. Pope Sixtus IV wanted the Medici removed to advance his own interests and those of his allies. The order was never written down. Instead, the message was clear enough: remove the Medici by whatever means were necessary. One of the central organizers was Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa. While assassins moved against the Medici, Salviati was meant to seize Florence's government buildings and take control of the city in the confusion. The attack was timed for Sunday Mass inside Florence Cathedral. That choice was deliberate. Killing the Medici in church would be public, shocking, and impossible to ignore. It would also send a message that no place, not even the most sacred, was beyond reach. When the moment came, the attack was carried out. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed repeatedly and killed on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo de' Medici was wounded but survived, escaping into the chaos. The plan collapsed instantly. The Medici were not removed. The city was not seized. And the church's protection vanished the moment the plot failed. The response was brutal and immediate. Conspirators were captured and executed without trial. Archbishop Salviati himself was seized and killed. Bodies were hung from public buildings. The Pazzi family was stripped of property, exiled, and erased from Florentine political life. History would remember this as the Pazzi conspiracy. But what mattered in Florence wasn't the name. It was the lesson. The Medici system had been attacked with church approval inside a cathedral during Mass, and it had survived. From that point on, everyone understood what challenging that system actually cost. After the conspiracy collapsed, Florence did not fall apart. It tightened. The Medici moved quickly to make sure the attack would never be treated as a political disagreement. It was framed as treason, not just against a family, but against the city itself. Inside Florence, the rules were now unmistakable. Families that had once pushed boundaries withdrew from public life. Political alliances narrowed. Ambition became cautious. Nobody needed to be told what had changed. Everyone could see it. But the most important fallout happened beyond the city. The killing of an archbishop during the retaliation triggered outrage in Rome. The Pope denounced Florence. Sanctions followed. The church attempted to isolate the city and punish the Medici for executing a senior cleric. It didn't work. Florence didn't collapse. Trade continued. Allies held, and the Medici remained in control. What became clear in the years that followed was something deeper. The church could threaten the Medici, but it couldn't remove them. Money still mattered. Influence still mattered. And now the Medici had proven they could survive a direct clash with both rival families and church-backed power. Over time, the relationship shifted. The Medici no longer treated the church as an authority standing above them. They treated it as another institution to be managed, negotiated with, funded, and eventually influenced. The lesson of the conspiracy was simple. Violence had failed, sanctions had failed, and public outrage had failed. From this point on, opposition didn't try to destroy the Medici system. It learned to work around it, or inside it. Florence returned to stability once again. But now that stability rested on three things: money, force, and legitimacy, the Medici had survived the most extreme challenge possible. What followed wasn't chaos, it was permanence. What the Medici built wasn't a dynasty in the traditional sense. They didn't rule by law, they didn't rule by force alone, and they didn't rule by faith. They ruled by designing a system that made resistance impractical. This wasn't accidental, it was learned. The Medici had already seen what happened when power was too visible. They had been exiled for it. When they returned, they rebuilt Florence so control no longer needed to announce itself. Institutions stayed in place. Elections still happened. Court still functioned. The church still spoke with authority. But outcomes stopped being unpredictable. Money controlled access. Violence enforced boundaries when needed. Legitimacy absorbed the consequences. Each layer supported the others. When money was enough, it kept the city quiet. When money wasn't enough, force was available. When force caused outrage, legitimacy softened the damage. Florence didn't feel conquered. It felt managed. That was the real achievement. The Medici didn't need to crush opposition repeatedly. They made it unviable. Over time, people adjusted their behavior. Resistance didn't fail dramatically. It failed by never forming. And this model didn't disappear when the Medici faded from power. A private family financing states, shaping politics from the shadows, surviving scandals and regime changes, all without ever ruling outright. Remind you of anybody? The Medici didn't invent banking. They didn't invent organized crime. They perfected a way to rule through money, institutions, and legitimacy, without needing to rule at all. So that wraps it up. A genuine thank you to everyone who tuned in, and to everyone who's already subscribed. It really does mean a lot and helps the channel. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more like it, feel free to subscribe. Next, we'll be looking at the medieval Mafia. the mercenary networks who enforced power and made violence a business long before the modern mob existed. See you guys in the next one.